The date is December 7th, 1941. The waters of Pearl Harbor shimmer beneath a calm Hawaiian sun. The sky is clear. American sailors go about their Sunday routines. And then, nothing happens. No distant hum of Japanese bombers, no sudden rain of fire, no smoke spiraling into the Pacific sky. History as we know it is silent. In this alternate world, Japan never attacks Pearl Harbor. The United States never receives that shock that pulled it into World War II. And from that single choice, one meeting, one decision in Tokyo, the entire course of the 20th century begins to shift. But what happens next? Does Japan still rise as an empire? Does Nazi Germany crush Europe unchallenged? And what kind of world would emerge if the United States had stayed neutral just a little longer? By the end of this video, we'll trace the chain reaction of this decision, from Tokyo's war room to Washington's Oval Office, and explore how a world without Pearl Harbor could have rewritten everything we know about modern history. Stay until the end, because this isn't just a story about a battle that didn't happen. It's a story about how fragile history really is, and how one decision could have changed who rules the world today. To understand the alternate timeline, we start with Japan's real dilemma in late 1941. Japan's empire was cornered. It relied on oil, steel, and rubber from the colonies it conquered. But after invading China and threatening Southeast Asia, the United States imposed an oil embargo. Japan had only about 2 years of fuel left. In our real history, Tokyo's leaders, led by Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, believed war was inevitable. The attack on Pearl Harbor was meant to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet, buying time to seize the resource-rich Dutch East Indies. But in this alternate timeline, that decision changes. This is a scenario where Japan's more cautious diplomats, men like Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who privately opposed war with America, win the argument. Instead of striking Pearl Harbor, Japan pursues a gamble. Expand southward, but avoid open conflict with the United States. Tokyo's plan is simple. Keep Washington neutral, take what resources they can from Asia, and fortify their empire before the Americans ever think of intervening. If the U.S. never enters the war in 1941, how long can Japan survive, and what happens to the balance of power across the Pacific? Without the Pearl Harbor attack, Franklin D. Roosevelt faces an impossible domestic battle. In 1941, most Americans opposed entering another foreign war. The trauma of World War I still lingered. Congress and the public were isolationist, determined to stay out of Europe's and Asia's conflicts. Without the shock of Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt cannot rally the nation for war. The America First movement remains strong. Military production slows. The draft faces resistance. Meanwhile, Japan moves rapidly through Southeast Asia, occupying Malaya, Borneo, and the Philippines through proxy or intimidation, but stopping short of direct attacks on U.S. forces. The Allies, Britain and the Netherlands, fight desperately to hold their colonies, but without American support, their situation darkens. By mid-1942, the Japanese Empire dominates most of East Asia, while the U.S. remains neutral, watching anxiously from across the Pacific. Across the Atlantic, another storm is brewing, one that will test whether America's neutrality can truly last. In Europe, the absence of America changes everything. Without the Lend-Lease Act in full force, Britain's war machine sputters. Supplies dwindle, convoys slow, the Luftwaffe regains the skies. And the German U-boats tighten their grip on the Atlantic. Hitler, emboldened by American neutrality, no longer fears a two-ocean war. Instead of declaring war on the United States, as he foolishly did after Pearl Harbor, he turns his full attention eastward. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, launches earlier and with greater focus. The Wehrmacht advances deeper into Soviet territory before winter sets in. By late 1942, Moscow is under siege. Stalin pleads desperately for Western aid, but Britain is exhausted and America still hesitates. In this version of history, Hitler might achieve what he never could in our timeline, the fall of the Soviet capital. The Eastern Front becomes a nightmare of attrition, but the Axis powers are no longer fighting a global coalition. Without American intervention, Europe's balance tips toward totalitarianism. Britain may survive, but only as a besieged island clinging to hope. Yet as the Reich stretches itself thin across Eurasia, Japan faces its own reckoning, one that will decide the future of the Pacific. By 1943, Japan's empire looks vast, but it's a brittle empire built on sand. Their supply lines stretch thousands of miles across the Pacific. Oil reserves shrink despite their territorial gains. Guerrilla wars erupt in China and the Philippines. And as Japanese brutality grows, local resistance movements multiply. Meanwhile, the United States begins to awaken from its isolationist slumber. American ships are sunk accidentally by Japanese forces. Pro-Japanese propaganda circulates in Asia, portraying the empire as the liberator of the East. These provocations chip away at American patience. Inside Washington, FDR faces mounting pressure. The economy is booming from arms production, the Navy grows restless, and the people, though reluctant, are beginning to see Japan as a looming threat. By late 1943, an incident, perhaps the sinking of an American vessel or an attack on the Philippines, finally breaks the fragile peace. America declares war, but 2 years later than in real history. The Japanese have had time to entrench across the Pacific, turning every island into a fortress. The war begins, but now the United States faces an empire far stronger and a world far darker than before. The Pacific War erupts in 1943 under very different conditions. Japan holds much of Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. The U.S. must now fight across an ocean filled with fortified islands and elite Japanese troops hardened by years of conquest. Unlike the quick momentum America gained after Midway in our real history, this version of the war drags on painfully. American casualties soar. The public's will is tested. In Europe, the situation is no better. The Soviet Union, crippled by years of brutal warfare, signs a ceasefire with Germany in 1944. The Reich controls most of continental Europe. Britain survives but is cut off. The U.S. now fights a two-front ideological war against Japan in the Pacific and a potentially victorious Nazi Germany across the Atlantic. The Manhattan Project still develops, but under increased secrecy and urgency. Without the European theater dominating attention, the first atomic bomb may even be tested against Japan earlier, perhaps on a military target like Truk or Okinawa. But what happens when the smoke clears? Who rebuilds the world, and what kind of world do they inherit? As the mushroom clouds fade, a new balance of power begins to emerge, one utterly alien to the world we know. By 1946, the war finally ends, but the victors are not the same. Japan, devastated by years of grinding warfare and a U.S. blockade, surrenders after the atomic bombings. But this time, the Soviet Union is shattered and Germany remains intact, a continental superpower ruling Europe under an iron fist. The Cold War doesn't emerge between the U.S. and the USSR. Instead, it's a tense rivalry between the American Republic and the German Reich. Democracy and fascism locked in a silent, nuclear-armed standoff. The Pacific is scarred. Millions die in Asia. Japan becomes a divided nation, half occupied by the U.S., half under German influence. The world that follows is colder, darker, and less certain. Without the moral clarity that Pearl Harbor gave America, the lines between good and evil blur. America's rise to global leadership happens later, slower, more cautious, shaped not by unity after an attack, but by fear after survival. The absence of Pearl Harbor didn't save lives. It only delayed the inevitable. But in doing so, it reshaped the world's entire balance of power and left humanity walking a much narrower edge between peace and annihilation. History often hinges on moments that seem small until they're gone. A telegram delayed by minutes, a general's hesitation, a fleet that never takes off. If Japan had never attacked Pearl Harbor, the United States might have stayed neutral longer. But the cost of that neutrality could have been a darker, divided world. A world where freedom came not through unity, but through fear. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a tragedy, but it forced a nation to awaken. Without it, tyranny might have spread unchecked. So when we ask, what if Japan never attacked Pearl Harbor? The answer is chilling. The 20th century might still have burned, just slower, colder, and with no clear victor. And maybe that's the true lesson of alternate history. Not just how things could have gone wrong, but how fragile the world really is when one choice, one morning, one spark can change everything. If you enjoyed exploring this alternate timeline, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more what-if scenarios that challenge the way we see history. Until then, remember, history isn't fixed. It's built on choices, and sometimes the smallest one can echo for centuries.